I'm here at the top of the Pacheco Pass, about 60 miles east of Monterey and the coast, a place where the coastal range dips and human pathways for thousands of years had crossed from the coastal plain and into the Central Valley of California. I'm here because this is a place where in April of 1868, a 29-year-old Scotsman by name of John Muir first crossed and into the Central Valley of California and witnessed it in its April splendor. Muir's story is one that parallels a great deal of major themes in California's history in the late 19th century. He was, like millions of Americans, millions of white Americans who were moving to California, an immigrant. He was born in Dunbar in Scotland on the coast, east of Edinburgh, beneath the cries of seabirds and the winds off of the North Sea. He'd been brought with his family to Wisconsin, and his father homesteaded a plot in the forests of Wisconsin, and Muir and his family had lived largely in isolation from other parts of American society, among other Scots, in a tightly knit religious community. Muir chafed at the boundaries and barriers of Eastern society, of the strictures of religious family life. He walked to Madison and spent a year at the University of Wisconsin, and then dissatisfied with life there, walked on down to Indianapolis and found a job in a factory where he was injured and nearly blinded, left unable to see for a period. And after that, Muir designed never again to be confined by the boundaries of industrial society. And in the 19th century, Muir would become one of the greatest critics of American industrialism and commercialism and its impacts on the landscape and also on the human societies that were there. Muir crossed the Pacheco Pass in April of 1868, 100 years after the Spanish friars had set up the mission at Monterey, and he saw the hand of commercialism everywhere upon the landscape, even as he could see what glories it still held. In a famous passage from Muir's diaries, we know that Muir crossed down into the Central Valley, and upon reaching its floor found it in absolute bloom, mostly in the colors of gold and purple, filled with of 1,000 shades and varieties. He sat down and set out a yard square on the floor of the valley and sat for several hours counting all of the blooms and blossoms of the innumerable flowers that were in that square yard, counting several thousand blossoms. It was that kind of attention to detail that marked Muir's interest in nature, its attention to the details of the connections among all of the living creatures in any landscape, and it illustrated a maxim of his that that all things were connected, and if you picked out on any one thing, that you found quickly that it was connected to everything else. Muir would become the principal critic in late 19th century America of commercialism and its impacts on the land, and he would become, of course, the prophet for the wilderness, for the mountains, for the preservation of parks and set-aside landscapes so that urban Americans could escape and experience what nature could bring them, which in Muir's mind was a connection with divine. Like other Americans, other white Americans of his age, Muir was insensitive to the plight of Native Americans, and it's striking in the ways that Muir's own search was to find a kind of balance between ecosystems of the environment and human society, the kind of balance that Native people of California had found and had nurtured for thousands of years. By the time Muir would encounter Modoc and Mono and Miwok peoples in the late 1860s and 1870s in Yosemite and in the Central Valley. All he was able to see was the impact of commercial society, the devastation that had wrought on California's native people. And like so many white Americans, Western Americans of the time, he could see them as a people of the past, people who had been here before, but who had been transformed by that same engine of evil that he railed against for his entire life. In any event, this is a good place to begin a conversation about the impacts of industrialism on 19th century California, and to continue our conversations about the relationships between human beings in California and the larger California environment, and to continue that conversation about the misunderstandings, the unequal structures in society, and the inequalities among different Californians and the ways that they encountered each other. So the top of the Pacheco Pass, the San Luis Reservoir behind me, over the top of California's Great Central Valley, and the story of John Muir.